They did not begin with a weapon. They began with subtraction, not of your breath but of your credibility, not of your heartbeat but of your dignity, not of your existence but of your place in the story, and that distinction matters. Because what the narcissist truly desires is not always your physical destruction, it is your erasure. They want you removed from the narrative in such a way that, when people speak your name, it carries distortion instead of truth. They wanted you to disappear quietly, to become unstable, to become difficult, to become misunderstood, and they believed they could perform that surgery without consequence. But here is where something shifted, and you felt it before you understood it. Because writing someone out of a story requires control. Control over perception, control over environment, control over who speaks and who remains silent. And that is where the first fracture began. When control slipped, desperation took over. A narcissist does not panic when they are angry. They panic when they are losing control. Anger is comfortable to them. It gives them energy. It gives them momentum. It gives them something to blame. But loss of control, that terrifies them. Because control is not just something they enjoy. It is the structure that holds their identity together. For a long time, they believed they had you positioned exactly where they wanted you. They understood your reactions. They anticipated your emotions. They knew which words would trigger guilt, which silences would trigger anxiety, which accusations would force you into defense. They studied you the way a strategist studies terrain. And you responded perhaps out of love, perhaps out of confusion, perhaps out of a sincere desire to fix what felt broken. But then something shifted. You stopped explaining. You stopped defending. You stopped trying to convince someone, determined not to understand. That was the moment control slipped. And when control slips from a narcissist, what replaces it is not humility. It is desperation. Desperation is louder than anger. It is sharper than criticism. It is more reckless than resentment. You may remember the shift clearly. The accusations became more dramatic. The narratives became more extreme. The pressure intensified. It felt as though the volume had been turned up overnight. That was not coincidence. That was panic. Because when a narcissist senses that their influence is weakening, they experience it as annihilation. They do not interpret your boundaries as maturity. They interpret them as betrayal. They do not interpret your calm as strength. They interpret it as defiance. And defiance, in their internal world, must be crushed. This is where many faithful people become confused. You thought peace would calm the storm. You thought silence would de-escalate tension. You believed restraint would eventually soften hostility. But when someone's identity is built on dominance, your restraint feels like rebellion. They speak to more people. They reshape stories. They test new tactics. They move from subtle manipulation to visible aggression. And here is the truth that is painful to admit. The more desperate they become, the more exposed they grow. When someone operates from panic, they make mistakes. They overplay their hand. They cross boundaries that once they were careful not to cross. Control is calculated. Desperation is sloppy. You might have noticed it in the way their words became inconsistent, in the way their stories shifted slightly depending on the audience, in the way their composure fractured when confronted with simple facts, because the narcissist does not fear losing you as much as they fear losing the illusion of superiority. They do not fear being alone as much as they fear being seen accurately. The moment you stepped out of their emotional grip, something irreversible began. They no longer had access to your reactions. They could not provoke you the way they once could. They could not destabilize you with the same ease. And without your reactions feeding their control, their structure weakened. So they pushed harder, not because they were strong, but because they were afraid. Afraid that the narrative would slip. Afraid that others would notice. Afraid that the version of reality they curated would begin to unravel. Fear disguised itself as aggression, and aggression leaves traces. When desperation drives behavior, it moves beyond personal conflict. It spills into professional spaces. It bleeds into public environments. It crosses lines that institutions recognize. They thought they were fighting you, but in their desperation, they began fighting boundaries that exist beyond you. Legal boundaries, ethical boundaries, communal boundaries. And boundaries beyond you do not respond to manipulation. They respond to evidence. This is where divine justice often appears subtle but exact. God does not always intervene by striking someone down. Sometimes he allows the natural momentum of desperation to accelerate until the consequences become inevitable. He does not have to destroy them. He simply allows their panic to reveal them. And when revelation meets structure, the results are swift. You may not have understood it at the time. You may have felt overwhelmed. You may have questioned why the pressure increased after you chose peace. But the escalation was not a sign that you were losing. It was proof that control had slipped beyond their reach. Your survival became the first crack. They were not prepared for your endurance. Everything they constructed depended on your collapse. Their confidence was built on a single assumption, that pressure would break you, that confusion would silence you, that isolation would shrink you. They expected tears to become instability. They expected fatigue to become surrender. They expected your silence to become disappearance. But you did not disappear. You did not implode. You did not spiral publicly. You did not give them the spectacle they were counting on. You survived. And survival, when someone is trying to erase you, becomes an act of defiance. Not loud defiance. Not dramatic defiance, but steady, quiet defiance. You kept showing up. You kept functioning. You kept carrying responsibilities that would have crushed a weaker spirit. And that consistency did something powerful. It contradicted them, because lies require evidence to sustain themselves. They need visible cracks in the target to feel believable. They need behavioral proof to justify the accusations. But when days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and your life did not unravel, something subtle began to shift in the atmosphere. People noticed, not necessarily consciously at first, but subconsciously, patterns register. If you were truly unstable, instability would surface. If you were truly dangerous, damage would appear. If you were truly what they claimed, the fruit would show, but it did not. Instead, what showed was resilience, and resilience is disruptive, because resilience exposes exaggeration. Resilience dismantles distortion. Resilience quietly asks, if the story were true, why is she still standing? Why is he still steady? You did not need to argue. Your continued presence argued for you. And that is what they did not anticipate. They prepared for a breakdown. They did not prepare for composure. They prepared for a public fall. They did not prepare for quiet dignity. And every day you remained intact became a microscopic fracture in the narrative they had built. But cracks do not stay small when pressure continues, because the more they insisted on a version of reality that did not align with observable truth, the more strain they placed on their own story. And strain reveals weakness, because your survival was not easy. It cost you sleep. It cost you peace. It cost you tears no one saw. There were nights when you questioned yourself, moments when the accusations echoed loudly enough to make you doubt your own memory. You prayed through confusion. You wrestled with hurt. You endured the ache of being misunderstood, but you did not surrender your integrity, and integrity under pressure becomes unbreakable. That is the part that shifts everything. Because once someone realizes they cannot destroy your stability, their aggression intensifies, but so does their exposure. They begin overcompensating. They begin explaining too much. They begin contradicting themselves. And observers, whether friends, colleagues, or authorities, start noticing the imbalance. Your steadiness becomes a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable for those who survive on illusion. You became the living contradiction to their claims. You were not trying to win. You were trying to heal. You were not trying to defeat them. You were trying to endure. But endurance under fire carries weight. In Scripture, survival often precedes revelation. The righteous are preserved long enough for truth to surface. The innocent endure long enough for accusation to unravel itself. You may not have felt powerful. You may have felt exhausted. But your survival shifted the spiritual gravity of the situation. Because once you did not collapse, the burden of proof moved. It moved from you to them. Suddenly, it was no longer about defending yourself. It was about explaining their aggression. And explaining aggression without evidence is difficult. More lies require more risk. There is a moment in every prolonged deception when the lie becomes too heavy to carry quietly. At first, distortion feels manageable. It is subtle. It is selective. A detail omitted here, a tone altered there, a memory reframed just enough to shift sympathy. In the beginning, they believed they could adjust reality without consequence. But deception is not static. It demands maintenance, and maintenance demands risk. One false statement must be reinforced by another. One exaggeration must be strengthened by a bolder claim. One manipulated conversation must be followed by another, more carefully crafted performance. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, what began as a private distortion turns into a full-time operation. They were no longer simply reacting. They were strategizing. They calculated who to speak to first. They chose words designed to trigger concern. They curated fragments of truth to disguise the falsehood beneath. But here is the part they did not account for. The more elaborate the story becomes, the more fragile it grows. Because truth does not require rehearsal. Truth does not require coordination. Truth stands without reinforcement. But a lie requires consistency across environments. It requires memory sharp enough to repeat itself flawlessly. It requires emotional discipline strong enough to avoid contradiction. And human beings, especially those fueled by pride, rarely sustain that kind of precision. When someone begins explaining excessively, they are often trying to outrun doubt. And doubt was rising, not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, because observers sense when something feels disproportionate, when hostility exceeds the alleged offense, when obsession outpaces logic. They began to push harder, not because they were confident, but because they sensed something slipping. When a narcissist feels their narrative weakening, they double down. They intensify the accusations. They increase the emotional charge. They widen the audience. It becomes urgent. It becomes desperate. And desperation abandons caution. They start contacting people they should not involve. They send messages they should not send. They say things in moments of anger that reveal more than intended. The discipline they once exercised erodes under pressure. And here is where the shift becomes profound. Because once deception crosses from emotional manipulation into tangible action, it leaves a trace. Messages can be saved. Calls can be recorded. Statements can be repeated by witnesses. What once felt like private tension begins to carry structural consequences. They may not have noticed when they crossed that line, but they did. And the crossing was not dramatic. It was incremental, one step further than before. One word harsher than usual, one accusation that could not be quietly dismissed. You might have felt the escalation emotionally, the temperature rising, the hostility sharpening. But what you could not see at the time was how each escalation increased exposure. Because lies expand outward until they collide with boundaries. Legal boundaries, professional boundaries, community boundaries. And boundaries do not negotiate with ego. While they intensified, you steadied. While they grew louder, you grew clearer. While they risked more, you withdrew from the chaos. And that contrast became undeniable. The wider they cast their accusations, the more people began noticing the imbalance. Why so much energy? Why so much fixation? Why so much repetition? Fixation reveals obsession. Obsession reveals insecurity. And insecurity under pressure becomes volatility. The structure they built to control perception began to strain under its own weight. Because every new lie demanded more bravery, more boldness, more recklessness. And recklessness is unsustainable. Eventually, they had to choose. Pull back and admit distortion, or continue forward and accept greater risk. Pride chose forward, and forward led beyond emotional harm into measurable consequence. Not because you forced it, but because deception, when stretched too far, snaps. And when it snaps, it does not collapse quietly. It collapses with exposure. They believed they were tightening their grip. In reality, they were loosening their protection. Each risk severed another thread of insulation. Each exaggeration chipped away at credibility. Each escalation invited scrutiny. And scrutiny does not ask for feelings. It asks for facts. More lies required more risk. More risk required more boldness. More boldness required less caution. And less caution led them into territory they could not control. God didn't strike. He removed the cover. There is a kind of justice that shouts, and there is a kind that simply steps back. Most people expect divine intervention to feel dramatic. A sudden collapse, a visible punishment, a moment so undeniable that no one can question it. But often, the way God corrects a situation is far quieter and far more exact. He does not always strike. Sometimes, He removes the cover. For a long time, they operated under protection they mistook for permanence. Their charm shielded them. Their confidence disarmed suspicion. Their social standing insulated them from scrutiny. People gave them the benefit of the doubt because they appeared composed, persuasive, even compassionate. And you, in contrast, may have appeared wounded, shaken, quiet. On the surface, the imbalance seemed unfair. But coverings are not eternal. There comes a moment when God allows what has been hidden to stand without assistance. He does not need to attack someone to expose them. He simply stops restraining the consequences of their own behavior. The protection lifts, and when it lifts, what remains is character. Without cover, exaggeration sounds excessive. Without cover, anger looks unstable. Without cover, manipulation appears obvious. It is subtle at first. A conversation that does not go as expected. A colleague who begins asking questions. A friend who hesitates instead of immediately agreeing. Small signs that the automatic loyalty they relied on is weakening. They feel it before they understand it. A shift in tone, a change in atmosphere, a slight withdrawal from people who once stood firmly beside them. It is exposure beginning to breathe. When the cover is removed, the narcissist loses their greatest weapon, assumed credibility. And credibility is oxygen to someone who lives on image. Without it, they scramble. They attempt to reassert control. They grow more animated, more urgent, more intense. But urgency without foundation sounds hollow. When God removes covering, He does it with precision. Not when you are at your weakest, but when you are steady enough to stand without fear. Not when they are prepared to spin the narrative again, but when their previous patterns have accumulated enough weight to speak for themselves. This is not revenge. It is revelation. And revelation is devastating to someone who built their world on illusion. Because once the cover is gone, there is no longer a shield between their actions and public perception. There is no buffer absorbing the consequences, no filter softening the impact. The same behaviors that once passed unnoticed now feel glaring. The same tone that once felt confident now sounds aggressive. The same stories that once seemed persuasive now feel rehearsed. They begin to sense that something has changed. The atmosphere is no longer protecting them. You may feel a strange stillness in this phase, a quiet before something decisive. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady. Because when God removes the cover, He does not need thunder. Truth does the work, and truth does not panic. It waits. It stands. It allows behavior to reveal itself without interference. The high point of this moment is not explosive. It is inevitable. The illusion thins. The alliances weaken. The inconsistencies surface. And what once looked powerful begins to look fragile. You did not orchestrate it. You did not demand it. You simply endured long enough for the covering to lift. And when it did, the difference between who you are and who they are became unmistakable. They thought they were secure. They were sheltered. And once the shelter was removed, the storm they created found its way back to them. Not through force, but through exposure. Jail is a pattern, not an accident. No one wakes up one morning and stumbles into ruin by chance. Collapse is rarely spontaneous. It is constructed. Brick by brick, decision by decision, compromise by compromise. And this is the truth many struggle to accept. Consequences that look sudden are often the final chapter of a long, invisible pattern. When we speak of jail, we are not speaking merely of iron bars or courtroom verdicts. We are speaking of the moment when behavior that was tolerated privately becomes undeniable publicly, when a pattern that hid in shadow becomes visible in structure. They told themselves each step was minor. It's just a message. It's just a call. It's just a warning. It's just pressure. But repetition transforms just into pattern. And systems, whether social, professional, or legal, do not respond to isolated emotion. They respond to repetition. This is where the shift becomes sobering. They thought they were reacting to you. They thought every escalation was justified because they felt threatened, exposed, or challenged. But institutions do not weigh feelings the way individuals do. They weigh behavior, and behavior leaves trails. A tone that once seemed assertive begins to read as intimidation. A confrontation once dismissed as misunderstanding becomes harassment when repeated. A manipulation once overlooked becomes coercion when it persists. The very boldness they wore like armor begins to look like liability. You may have watched this unfold slowly, almost painfully. You may have sensed that something larger was forming but could not yet name it. Because patterns build quietly. At first, there is room for explanation. Then there is room for warning. Then there is room for concern. And then, suddenly, there is no more room. Not because anyone is vengeful, not because you demanded it, but because repetition reached a threshold. There is a moral law woven into human systems. It does not function emotionally. It functions consistently. When someone believes they are untouchable, they stretch further. When someone avoids consequence repeatedly, they assume immunity. And immunity breeds overconfidence. Overconfidence erases caution. Caution is what once restrained them from crossing certain lines. Caution is what once whispered, "Stop here." But when pride silences caution, risk multiplies. They were not simply trying to overpower you. They were rehearsing behavior that would eventually expose them. Each attempt to intimidate hardened into documentation. Each effort to distort turned into record. Each escalation moved from personal conflict into measurable violation. And here is the irony that cuts deeply. They believed you were the unstable element. But stability is proven by restraint. You restrained yourself when provoked. You stepped back when pressured. You chose silence when insulted. They chose reaction. Over time, that contrast becomes visible. The one who remains steady appears grounded. The one who escalates appears volatile. Volatility under scrutiny becomes case material, and once scrutiny begins, it rarely stops halfway. Because scrutiny asks questions that ego cannot answer convincingly. Why this intensity? Why this repetition? Why this fixation? Answers rooted in pride crumble quickly. The system does not need drama. It needs evidence. And evidence accumulates without emotion. You may have feared that nothing would ever change, that their boldness meant victory, that their confidence meant protection. But confidence without accountability is fragile. It stands only until documentation aligns. An investigation opens. A complaint is validated. A charge is filed. Sudden to the outside world, but not sudden at all. It is the visible consequence of an invisible pattern reaching completion. Jail is not an accident. It is accumulation. It is the final echo of repeated disregard for boundaries that were clearly marked but intentionally crossed. They tried to take your life but lost their own structure. When we say they tried to take your life, we are not speaking only of physical harm. They tried to take your peace. They tried to take your stability. They tried to take the rhythm of your days and replace it with fear. They wanted you uncertain. They wanted you questioning yourself. They wanted your confidence to fracture under pressure, because if your inner structure collapsed, they could remain intact. That was the unspoken exchange. If you fall, they stand. If you weaken, they appear strong. But something happened they did not foresee. You bent, but you did not break. You grieved, but you did not disintegrate. You questioned, but you did not abandon truth. And in surviving, you preserved the one thing they underestimated, your foundation. You see, a narcissist's power is rarely built on depth. It is built on projection, on carefully curated perception, on scaffolding that looks solid from a distance, but has never been tested under sustained pressure. Your life was tested. Their image was not. When the pressure intensified, your character deepened. You prayed more honestly. You examined yourself more rigorously. You sought counsel. You clung to what was true even when it hurt. Pressure refined you. Pressure exposed them. In trying to destabilize you, they stretched their own structure beyond its capacity. They extended themselves further than their integrity could sustain. They reached into areas that required consistency, patience, and discipline, qualities they had not cultivated. Inconsistencies between who they claimed to be and how they behaved. Tension between their projected morality and their private aggression. Gaps between their words and their actions. And those gaps widened. Because projection cannot survive long without substance, you, on the other hand, were forced into substance. You learned endurance. You practiced restraint. You chose not to retaliate recklessly. Every time you held your ground without cruelty, your foundation strengthened. Every time you refused to mirror their hostility, your integrity solidified. They were trying to remove your life from its footing. Instead, they loosened their own. And when structure begins to fail, collapse can look instantaneous. A reputation that took years to build fractures in weeks. A network of influence dissolves under scrutiny. A sense of invincibility evaporates when accountability arrives. It feels sudden, but it was cumulative. They believed your downfall would secure their stability. But stability built on control is temporary. Stability built on character endures. They aimed at your existence. They destabilized their own architecture. And when accountability finally reaches someone whose foundation is already cracked, the fall is swift. Not because God delights in destruction, but because structures that lack truth cannot stand indefinitely. You were protected, so you could walk away clean. This is the part that matters most. Not their collapse, not their exposure, not even the legal consequences that may follow. What matters most is this: you walked away clean. They tried to pull you into a war that would have required you to become someone you are not. They wanted you reactive, bitter, vindictive. They wanted you to fight in a way that would stain your own conscience. But you did not. You endured. You stepped back when retaliation felt justified. You chose restraint when revenge felt tempting. You held on to faith when anger would have been easier. That is not weakness. That is strength refined. And this is the value for you, the one listening, the one who has lived through confusion and accusation and sleepless nights. Divine justice is not only about what happens to them. It is about what did not happen to you. You did not lose your integrity. You did not lose your moral clarity. You did not lose your alignment with God. Their path leads toward consequence. Yours leads toward peace. And peace is not passive. It is earned through restraint, through prayer, through refusing to let someone else's darkness define your character. You may never celebrate what unfolds in their life, but you will breathe differently, knowing you did not compromise your soul to survive. That is the deeper victory. You were protected not so you could watch them fall, but so you could move forward unburdened. No guilt. No hidden shame. No secret retaliation. Just clarity. And clarity, in the hands of God, becomes freedom. Stand steady. Let justice unfold without your interference. And remember, the greatest proof of divine protection is not that your enemy falls. It is that you remain faithful while they do.